Let me just say that very, very briefly that I'm speaking out of my own very recent trauma. I had an adult daughter, professor of physics at Hope College, who was horrifically killed in a car accident where one of the alums of the college was going 102 miles an hour through a red light and T-boned her. So I know about trauma personally, and I also know about trauma healing personally. Today is the 7th-month anniversary, if you call it that, of the death, of Jenny's death. So if I'm a little wobbly, you'll know why. But this is dear to my heart, trauma healing is, and I'd like to talk to you about how we can use this particular tool as part of the holistic ministry of hospitality that Michael was talking about. So let's just jump right in. What is trauma? Well, trauma, according to the American Bible Society's Trauma Healing Institute, and it's their materials that I've used. Interestingly, Brad, the ABS, or the Wycliffe Bible translators, developed this material out of their work with Congolese, knowing the deep trauma that they'd had in wars. Mm-hmm. Trauma is a deep wound of the heart and mind that takes a long time to heal, and it hurts every part of us, our relationships, our bodies, our thoughts, and our faith. And from a more secular perspective comes this additional insight that trauma comes as an external, overwhelming force that seeks to annihilate a person, causing hopelessness. Hopelessness is so significant. And so if we can go to the next slide that says signs and symptoms of trauma, when you meet your new friends, your Afghan friends, as they come into your communities, you may very well see signs and symptoms of trauma. Because trauma affects our bodies, our minds, our emotions, and our faith, we will see evidence of that in our body, their bodies, minds, emotions, and faith. For example, headaches, stomach aches, loss of appetite. That's the physical, right? The mental could be unclear thinking, malaise, hypervigilance, and obsessiveness. Or emotional, sudden, unexplained anger, depression, withdrawal, anxiety, and suicidal thoughts. And then on the communal or faith, spiritual relationship, a breakdown of relationships and a loss of hope. And if loss is very crucial to trauma because loss defines it. Just think of the people coming from Afghanistan. They've lost their homes. They've lost their language. They can't speak Dari to very many people. They've lost their jobs, which is not only income, but it's also status in their community. They've probably lost family members, either physically to death or the break from them as they've had to run away. They've lost their culture, which is just the water we swim in. Now they have to learn to swim in all new water that is not very friendly sometimes. They've lost trust in people, perhaps even in family members who might have betrayed them. They've lost faith in their institutions to work well, their governments to perform the services governments provide. They may very well have lost faith in religion, as that is true of many refugees from the Middle East, and maybe even loss of their own trust in their own self. If you are not in control, if you're being pushed about by all the forces of geopolitical actors, and you can't make decisions that you want to make to affect your family, you've lost agency. And with that, you've lost identity, who you are as a person. Sometimes these are called ambiguous losses because they'll continue even if there is a new home, a new language, and a new job. These things that you used to hold dear to yourself just are not true anymore. I'm going to very briefly go through 5 or 6 pictures to remind you visually of what the Afghans who are coming here to our country have experienced. And Brad, there's probably about 6 pictures we'll go through very quickly. For one, there's the being constantly surrounded by barbed wire and soldiers. There is the destruction of homes. It might be your home, it might just be in your community. If someone has been injured, and you probably know someone who has been injured, you have to take it upon yourselves to get them help, and there may not be help available. This is a picture of families running to the airport in the streets. knowing that they only had so much time to get there and what would be greeting them, worrying about what would be greeting them at the entrance. The next is a picture at the entrance to the airport, to the Bagram airport. And just look, soldiers are pointing their guns down at you while you're reaching up your hands for help. Here's in the early days when people were running to those planes that weren't organized yet. Would they even get on? And here's a picture of people trying to get onto a plane, not all of them making it. Each one of these things by themselves is traumatic, and then you add them up. But actually, and we can go to the next slide now, Brad, thanks. Trauma for Afghans is long-term. There have been 20 years of the most recent war between the United States and the Taliban. But really, the war stretched back for generations, all the way to the late 70s, with the Taliban in control of the country for a while, and then prior to that, the Russians. The average age, or the median age of Afghans is 18 years. That means that there are not very many people who have not lived, who know nothing but war, right? War has stretched on that long. Then there, of course, was the immediate terror of leaving. There can be guilt for being the lucky ones who got out but left behind other people whom you love. And the resettlement process itself can be very traumatic. Doesn't have to be, but it often is. Okay, let's turn now quickly to the biblical basis for helping Afghan refugees heal. Michael and Brad have talked to you about the agencies that help with housing, education, medical needs, job acquisition. Mentioned World Relief or Samaritas is another, Bethany is a third, these national ones. And then sponsors come alongside to help with some of this as well. But if we are coming to help our new neighbors as Christians, we have a responsibility to help them on the road to emotional and spiritual healing. They're not going to be able to hear us talk about God unless they have felt his love in their lives. Why is this the case? Why should we be helping them? Well, most basically, these dear people are created in the image of God. They are beloved by God. Therefore, we know with what Jesus said, whatever you do to the least of these, my brethren, you do to me. So when you're looking into the eyes of your new Afghan friend, the person who's looking back at you is Jesus. But lest you think, and then we could go to the next slide, lest you think that I'm just cherry picking a verse or two, I want to show you very, very quickly that this is the arc of the Bible's narrative. A quick trip through biblical history will show that this is God's intention for his people all along. We started back in Genesis, the creational dignity of all people. Cain asking, am I my brother's keeper? With the answer being, well, yes, you are. Exodus is a story of freedom from oppression. Once the Israelites were free from the Egyptians, they had to learn how to live as free people. And that includes in the law, caring for the outsiders. The nation, of course, had a rocky history. And during that, some of its most important people, like King David, for example, wrote Psalms. 60 of the Psalms in our Bible are Psalms of lament. And we'll come back to lament a little bit later in the presentation. But lament is crying out to God, why has this happened? When the Israelites failed to obey the law, failed to care for the poor and dispossessed, they fell under God's judgment. And eventually that landed them in exile, where they themselves were refugees again. But during that exile, they were given a promise of a future. And included in that is this wonderful phrase from Isaiah, by his stripes you are healed. Well, you know that his is Jesus. And Jesus eventually came preaching the gospel of the kingdom, which includes healing and freedom for the oppressed. Jesus engaged people and throughout his whole ministry in a loving, caring way by building relationships with them that gained their trust so that they could share their heart with him. Many examples of that, but just think, for example, of the woman at the well. And then just before Jesus died, he talked about the future judgment. And in that, he said that phrase that I've already quoted, inasmuch as you have done it, in other words, cared for the least of these, you have done it to me. One theologian goes so far as to say the crucifixion and the resurrection is in a very real way a story of trauma and grace. The trauma of the crucifixion, and when you stop to think about it and visualize it, you know how traumatic that day was. But then the grace that flowed out of that trauma. Just before Jesus ascended to his Father, he said to his disciples, "Peace be with you, so send I you." In other words, you go and be Jesus to the people that you will meet. Hope is promised by the gospel. Shalom is not just an absence of war, but it's a condition of a healed and whole heart and mind that can flourish. And lastly, Brad has talked about the vision and revelation of all peoples coming to gather together. But in that new heavens and new earth, our tears will be wiped away. So you can see this takes the whole arc of a biblical narrative, and woven through it is this desire for God that his peoples all around the world will be free, will be healed. So that brings us to what is trauma healing, because trauma healing is a method that's used to enhance the possibility for healing of trauma. And we've already established that our friends will have had trauma or are experiencing it still. Well, trauma healing, and I'm using the American Bible Society, Wycliffe Bible Translators, trauma healing materials, as do thousands and thousands of people around the world. Trauma healing is a method consisting of practical lessons that lead people on a journey of healing. At its heart is the Bible, which tells us about the love of God, though the purpose, I must add, of trauma healing is not conversion, it's healing. It's out of that healing that people will be in a position then to hear the gospel. We never use trauma healing with Muslims as a bait and switch to a conversion situation. If it comes out of the friendship. Trauma healing combines the best practices of the mental health community with the Bible's message of hope and healing. It brings together a group of people in a safe place where they can tell their stories and help each other heal. Its supporting materials are available in about 150 languages, not yet in Dari, unfortunately. The oral version, which is meant for refugees, is meant for non-readers, is especially good for refugees, and it uses refugee stories. And just recently, the American Bible Society has published a new Tell People What to Think and asked to help the participants be empowered to engage with themselves, with God, and with each other. Each oral version, and oral is the refugee version, each contains a story of a refugee with open-ended questions, because as you know, stories draw us in and allow us to identify with the characters. And the characters have gone through situations very similar to our new friends' situations. It has a parallel Bible story, again, with open-ended questions like, what happened? What happened next? What did you like about this story? What was difficult about this story? And also, because trauma affects the whole person, physically, emotionally, mentally, it doesn't just appeal to our minds with a storytelling. It engages our body physically. An exercise might be deep breathing, for example, or it engages the mind and heart creatively, drawing a picture, or there's an exercise with a bottle that shows about what happens when you repress your emotions, writing a lament, literally taking your pain to God, and then a skit about carrying the weight of unforgiveness. Each of these engages the whole person to help the whole person heal. And also included is suggestions for music, because music is a very healing method, or a mode, I should say. So let's go to the arc. Major lessons. There's many others that are individual, like, for example, suicide or abuse. But the major ones take you through an arc of healing, just like the Bible has an arc from creation to new creation. This is an arc from the wounds of the heart, and then added for the Muslim-friendly version, lesson cleansing shame, because Muslims, and I would claim that many more of us too, operate in an honor-shame context. That shame is an additional barrier to healing. So there's a lesson on that. There's the grief journey that's visualized for folks. And I can't tell you where I am on mine. I don't know how that all works, but anyhow, there's this grief journey. Then and only then does it ask the question, why does God allow suffering? Doesn't start there with a theological question. It starts with a lived experience and works towards it. Then there's crying out to God, which is lament. At the top, you can see in the picture, the top of that arc is taking our pain to God. And then lastly, there's forgiveness. And out of that comes opportunity to rebuild and for resilience. Let's go to the next one, because I think this isn't something you can use, even if you don't take the training to become a trauma healer. People are invited to tell their stories very early on in the process. And then in order not to be like Job's friends, in order to be good and helpful listeners yourselves, I want to give you 3 questions that you can ask anyone once you've gained their trust. In other words, you're not going to be like the reporter who sticks a microphone in someone's face and says, how did you feel when your house burned down? That reporter doesn't have a relationship with the person. Once you have trust, even without the rest of the trauma healing program, you may ask, what happened? How did it make you feel? And what was the worst part for you? And I can almost guarantee you that out of these questions, as they begin to answer them, will come some healing tears. So remember those, and I know that they're going to be recorded on the PowerPoint, so you'll be able to come back to them. Okay, if we move through the process, we come to lament. And this trauma healing material uses Psalm 13 as a profoundly simple lament that can be used as a model. It contains the 4 elements of lament that all the Psalms have, except one. One doesn't have the last statement of trust, but all laments address God directly. All laments make a complaint against them. Why? Why did this happen? How long do I have to wait for you? Those kind of complaints. It asks for a request for help. Come along and help me solve this problem. And it usually ends with a statement of trust in God. Now, if I can just make one quick caveat about this, is that Muslims are going to be more reluctant than other folks to complain to God, because God for them is distant, pure, unapproachable. And you don't tell him that something's wrong. You submit. And we know as believers that we have that relationship with God that will let us do that, which is why we end with a statement of trust in him. Okay, the picture next, Brad. The top of the process is taking your pain to the cross, or the pain to God in the case of Muslims. And this just visualizes what we've done with a few people. The little basket there is a place for them to take their list of pains. This is why I'm hurting. This is what hurts me. This is what upsets me. And put it on a piece of paper and then shred it into tiny little bits. Put it in that basket next to the cross and give it to God to take care of. Later on, those papers can be burned or thrown away, but we couldn't burn something in the church, so we just had a basket. All right, one more picture for in the story, the set itself, and that's the cycle of forgiveness. That forgiveness is not something that happens automatically, but often we circle back and come back to it again until finally there's freedom. And I think this is a very, very realistic picture of freedom. I want to end with 3 slides. The next one, addressing a practical problem. How do you overcome language barriers while you're doing this? We found that Google translation apps on phones can be a help, at least for individual words or phrases. They can't translate whole stories, of course. And I'm sure that the American Bible Society folks are in the process of trying to find Dari translators who could translate this material into Dari. And that's jumping down to my 3rd point, but they are in Farsi, which is in the American Bible Society's list of languages. It's called modern Persian. And there probably are some of your friends who do know Farsi. So you could use the material in that language if you're trained to do the materials. But some of the families might even know some English, particularly the fathers if they've worked with American NGOs or soldiers. This picture is a picture of some words in Turkish that I used with an Azerbaijani woman who speaks Turkish. My partner and I did nothing else for her, we gave her some vocabulary for her pain. She did not know what she was feeling. She did not know that that these burdens were in that language that could be healed, or that there was liberty from the oppression she felt, and that she could have courage and faith and peace. We gave her vocabulary if we gave her nothing else. But we also gave her a story, and that was the story of Jesus healing Lazarus. And when I said Jesus wept, and then I also phrased that as God cried, she was astonished. No, she said, because her version of God is an impassive, distant person who doesn't enter our sorrows. And when she learned that about God, that he cries with us, that was life-changing for her. And with that notion of Jesus wept, I would like to finish with this. So the last slide, thanks, Brad. This is from Psalms of Lament by Anne Weems. Jesus wept, and in his weeping, he joined himself forevermore to those who mourn. He stands now throughout all time, this Jesus weeping, with his arms about the weeping ones. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. He stands with the mourners, for his name is God with us. Jesus wept. Thank you for listening.